What is going on, guys? Vanity here, back with volume 17 of the In the Style of series, this time reverse engineering the sound of J. Lewis. This is the composition I'm going to be taking you through today, which is a remake of Bryson Overtime, produced by J. Lewis.
I've been working on it, putting in overtime, putting in overtime, putting in over. I've been putting in work, I've been working overtime, working overtime, working over.
The chapter times for each segment are, as always, in the pinned comment below. As there isn't much information out there about J. Lewis or his equipment, I want to dig straight into this week's composition. We'll start with the bass line. Here is how it sounds soloed. J. Lewis's and many of Soul Action artists' bassline have always been a topic for discussion among producers who are looking to achieve something similar in their own records. I didn't make this bassline exactly the same as the one in Overtime, as I wanted to emphasise certain parts and this effect, so I could better both give you an example of the sound and show you the inner workings. The actual sound design process, if you could even call it that, is very, very simple. I only say that because upon hearing an 808 with so much movement, we can automatically presume it's more complex than it actually is. The melody gets slightly more complex, which I'll cover in just a minute, but the sound itself is an 808 sample from my J. Lewis sample pack that I've quite literally just dropped into an instance of Simpler. This sound can be achieved with any sampler, however, as I haven't touched any of the controls within Simpler. I've just dropped the sample straight into it and left it alone. The processing chain that follows down here only enhances the sound. These plugins are not doing anything to change the actual foundation of the sound. From left to right, we've got an EQ rolling off everything above 1000 kHz with a gentle 12 decibel slope. Now usually, I'll take this low pass filter all the way down to 100 Hz, but because of the 808 rising in pitch, I needed to give it more space in the mix. And because it's so fast and sharp, it doesn't actually interfere with the music sample or Tiller's vocal. The next device is a compressor, or a leveling amplifier if you want to be precise. This is just my choice for a compressor, as I'm a fan of how this one sounds across pretty much anything I've thrown at it. Please don't feel that you need these plugins to achieve a similar sound, because that's just not true. An EQ and a compressor are there to do a job. The reason you'd want to use a compressor in this instance is to control the dynamics of the bass as it's jumping around so much. Because of the quick changes in the pitch, the volume would jump all over the place unless it's properly controlled. I like to keep my bass really tight and in place, as it's the foundation of any track. The two next compressors are sidechaining the kick and the snare drum to this bass. Now for the kick, this allows it a little extra breathing room when it hits with the 808, as otherwise one can mask the other unless there is a big volume difference. I applied the sidechain compressor for the same reason on the snare too, as when the bass goes up in pitch, I didn't want it to interfere with the snare at all. I also like the groove that the sidechain compressor can bring to a track. Having the bass line move around the drums really gives it an extra layer of movement. The next plugin I've actually got bypassed, as I decided not to go with it, but it was basically adding in some mid-range to the 808. Now this can be something definitely worth trying out, as it can have a drastic impact on how your bass is heard and perceived. Many speaker mediums don't have the components to reproduce a solid sine wave bass, so adding in some mid-range harmonics can allow such mediums to reproduce the melody of it. It can also just make the 808 sound a lot thicker, but obviously this will depend on the 808 in your project. Camel Crusher is a free plugin from Camel Audio that you can use to do just this, and I've provided a link in the description for you guys. The utility device on the end here was just being used to automate the volume, but I later removed it. The reason for using a utility instead of the volume faders is because if all the faders are being automated, I just can't mix a record. Having volume automation separate allows me to change the volume without affecting the automation, but the utility plugin does only go down to minus 35 decibels, which isn't complete silence, so for any complete volume fade outs you may have to use the fader. So I'd now like to move into the melody of this bass line, which is where quite literally the magic happens. If I open it up and zoom in here, you can see that we've got a fairly normal looking bass melody down here, and then these random notes that hit a couple of octaves higher in some instances up here. Pay special attention to this note placement. If it helps, pause this video, set up an 808 in your own sampler and copy some similar notation into the MIDI editor. Me showing you this will definitely help, but actually performing a task or recreating something you've seen or heard really solidifies it in your mind. I'll play this section back a few times while you can see the notes. Now I can't give you a super technical answer as to why you need these notes to be re-triggered before it slides up to the higher octave, but if it's not there, the portamento effect just doesn't work. I'm guessing it's because the 808 has almost died out by this point in the note, so this second note just starts it over again, allowing the sound to glide upwards in pitch. That's really all I've got to say on the bass. The key, as I said, is having the notes an octave or two higher than the main pattern, so the 808 can slide between them. I'd also recommend you have the 808 hitting alongside the kick drum, but do vary this pattern. If the 808 just follows the kick, or vice versa, without doing its own thing here and there, it can make the track extremely repetitive. Some producers think that the bass line is there to kind of complement the kick, while others believe that the 808 is a completely separate instrument and should be treated as one, and I'm definitely in the latter camp. Side note also guys, if you ever have any questions about anything in these tutorials or just a general production related question, either comment it below or fire me over a message on Instagram. I may not always respond straight away, but I will respond eventually. Alright, I'd like to move on to the drums now. Altogether, they sound like this. They're made up from 2 kicks, 2 snares, a snap, a clap, and some hats. We'll start with the kick drum, which sounds like this, soloed. As always, my 2 kicks are bussed together in a group, allowing me to process them together. Jay Lewis's music is heavily focused around the bass line, and the kick drum is there to do one of 2 things in my own opinion. The first is to add emphasis to that 808 to really bring it to life and make it pop out of the speakers. The second is just for that pure head bobbing feel, giving it that groove that all LA beat music seems to have. The sound or tone of the kick drum is really important too. At least in most of the music he's produced for Tiller, the kicks have almost a distorted sound to them. Not distorted meaning they're clipping, but in the way of distorting the mid harmonics. You can do this using that free plugin I mentioned earlier, Camel Crusher. There's a preset called British Clean, which should work nicely. I kept the processing on the group bus super simple, consisting of an EQ rolling off everything under 50Hz and taking a little dip out around 500Hz. For my regular viewers, you'll be used to seeing this configuration. I don't tend to ever boost on EQs as I really don't think it's necessary if you just pick the right samples to start with. To achieve a similar style kick drum to Jay Lewis, I'd go for a low kick combined with a more mid-range centered kick, and that one you can apply some of the harmonic distortion to in order to bring out some of those mid-range tones. The compressor next, well, I'm guessing it's kind of self-explanatory as to why I'm compressing these 2 sounds together, but make sure you keep an eye on how much gain reduction is being applied, as too much will really kill the punch of your kick drum, which is something that's super important in Jay Lewis's music. That's it for the kick. I'd like to move on to the snare now. Here's how it sounds, soloed. As you can hear, I've gone for 2 slightly different snare drums with an alternating 1-bar pattern. This was done to emulate the original, as that had a similar pattern. Each hit is a combination of 3 hits, with the snap and the bottom snare playing on them both. I like to keep 1 or 2 hits the same in the snare and alternate the third to give this drum groove some consistency and a bit of a backbone. Now, J. Lewis's hits are normally pretty tight, especially in the Tiller projects. You can use devices such as a transient shaper to tighten up looser hits, or with long tails, but as I said earlier, I like to spend more time on finding the right samples to begin with. The EQ configuration is similar to the kick drum. We're rolling off at 100Hz and again at 11kHz. The roll at 11kHz was made to make the snare sound darker and push it back slightly in the mix. Sometimes snares can sound too bright and too forward. Compression can sometimes help this, but I just find rolling off the high frequencies does the job nicely. It's mainly when layering claps, snaps and rims together, as they all contain plenty of high-end detail. The compressor is exactly the same as on the kick, taking off around 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction. The only other processing I've applied is sent the snare group to a reverb bus with a medium decay time. I'd always recommend sending pretty much everything in a mix to a reverb bus besides your kick and your bass, as you want everything to sound like it was recorded in one space. Well, in most cases at least anyway. I've got a little bit more going on with the hats. We'll jump into them now. They sound like this, soloed. I'll skip over the EQ and the compressor, as it's pretty much the same as on the snare, just a little more drastic on both ends. I've got one hat that's being automated up and down in volume, giving it more of a shuffled feel. The hat rolls that are in there are just being automated down in volume and then back up with this automation curve, as you can see here. Again, just remember to do your automation with the utility plugin. The simple delay plugin at the end here is applying the hat effect to the hats. For those that don't know, I'll just spend a few seconds explaining what the hat effect is, as I think it's a really great technique for spreading out your percussion. The hat effect is an acoustic phenomena in which a listener correctly identifies the direction of a sound source that is heard by both ears, but which arrives at each at slightly different times. If the second arriving sound that's heard by the ear further to the source is within about 10 to 35 milliseconds to the first arriving sound, it is not taken into account for locating the sound source. If the sound arrives within less than 10 milliseconds of each other, the sound source seems to move towards the location of the first arriving sound. When said sound arrives beyond 35 milliseconds of each other, the 2 distinct sounds are perceived. I've linked a couple more articles to it in the description for some further reading. In this instance, it's spreading the hats out across the stereo spectrum, making them sound super wide, or at least that's the perceived effect. All of the drums you just heard, as well as a couple hundred more, are from my J. Lewis sample pack, available now on Samples by Vanity. Also, quick side note, for anyone who chooses to support what I do over on Patreon, I've actually set up a package where for $20 a month, you can pick any 2 out of the 4 sample packs each month to download. Basically, they're half price and you can pick any 2 that you'd like. This also includes past sample packs. Okay, I'd like to move on to the musical sample and then cover my mastering chain. The musical sample sounds like this, soloed. Now, I sampled this from the original record. Just to be clear, I've not recreated this. A few people online have stated that it's just a reversed chord progression. I've actually already reversed this reverse sound, so it's now playing forwards, and I've then flipped round the pieces, so it's exactly how it originally would have been. This is how it sounds. The first half definitely sounds like some kind of melody, maybe even rows layered with some kind of pad. but there is a vocal sample in that second half towards the end, and a bunch of white noise that may even be a field recording of waves crashing. So it could even be a sample itself, only J. Lewis knows. But I am interested in hearing your thoughts below as to what it could be. Oh, the vocals at the bottom here are just the instrumental that I've tried my best to remove as much of the instruments as possible. It's also sidechained to the kick and snare in my version, which are basically now replacing the original drums. Okay, I'd now like to cover the mastering chain. Starting with the EQ, I'm rolling everything off under 250Hz and boosting at 11 kHz on the sides of the track. The boost at 11 kHz seems to really open up the high end on the sides of the records, and it's something I've begun to do on pretty much most of the tracks I master. Anything under 250Hz in a track should be in mono anyway, and this just ensures that nothing below that frequency is present on the sides of the record. The next, well, 3 compressors actually are all applying some gentle glue compression over the master bus. The first is a Shadow Hills mastering compressor. Now I'm a real fan of how this thing sounds, and it's the most recent addition to this chain. The 2 PSP old-timer plugins have been a staple for me in my mastering chain for years. One is compressing the sides of the record, and the other the middle. We've then got my limiter, which is PSP's Xeon. It sounds super transparent, and actually came out on top when I tested a bunch out. As you guys know if you've watched any of my earlier tutorials, I used to use Wave's L2 limiter, which is still a fantastic limiter, but the Xeon just had the edge I felt. It does also have a lot more controls on it too. I always leave 0.2 decibels of headroom for any intersample peaks that may occur on the listener's end, even though this plugin is supposed to compensate for any. Alright, that's all I've got for you today guys. As always, thank you for watching, and remember to share your suggestions for future tutorials in the comments section below. I'll talk to you guys in the next one. I'm out. Peace.